For most, the world is a symphony, a cacophony of rustling leaves, distant laughter, the rhythmic thrum of a heartbeat, the whispered secrets of the wind. Yet imagine a world stripped of this intricate tapestry of sound, a silent, vibrating canvas where every movement is a tremor, every voice a silent contortion of lips. How, then, could such a being, born into this profound stillness, ever hope to command the very essence of sound, to weave melodies so rich, so resonant they could stir the souls of thousands? It is a paradox defying logic, a riddle whispered in the hushed parlors of the mid-9th century, a question that haunted the very air around a woman named Elizabeth. Her story is not one of divine intervention or mystical gifts, but of a different kind of miracle. One born of human ingenuity, desperation, and a chilling manipulation of the senses. It is a tale that will make you question the very nature of perception, and perhaps the darkness that can lurk beneath the most extraordinary beauty. Prepare yourself, for the curtain is about to rise on a performance unlike any other, where the silence is as profound as the song. If you find yourself drawn into this unsettling narrative, if the mystery of Elizabeth's voice compels you to listen further, consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten histories, more chilling truths from the shadows of the past. The year was 1847. The air in rural Maryland hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and ripening tobacco leaves. A perpetual haze of humidity clung to the sprawling fields of the Caldwell estate. Life on the plantation for those who toiled under the relentless sun was a monotonous cycle of dawn to dusk labor, punctuated by the distant, mournful calls of field hands and the sharp crack of a whip. Yet within the confines of the main house, a different kind of silence reigned, one both profound and perplexing. Elizabeth, born into the Caldwell household, was a child of striking contrasts. Her skin, the color of polished mahogany, seemed to absorb the light, while her eyes, large and luminous, held a depth that belied her tender years. From her earliest days, it was evident she was different. The clatter of pots in the kitchen, the boisterous laughter of the other children, the sharp commands of Mrs. Caldwell, none of these elicited a reaction from the infant Elizabeth. She would watch, her gaze unwavering, as if observing a silent play unfold before her. Her mother, a quiet woman named Clara, who worked in the Caldwell's laundry, was the first to notice. Clara would sing soft lullabies, her voice a gentle hum, but Elizabeth's eyes would remain fixed, unblinking, on her mother's moving lips, never responding to the melody. When a heavy pot crashed to the stone floor, sending shards scattering, the other children shrieked and cried, but Elizabeth merely turned her head slowly, her expression unreadable. It was as if the world's sounds were a secret language she was not privy to. Mrs. Caldwell, a woman of stern demeanor and practical concerns, initially dismissed it as a peculiarity. "The child is simply quiet," she'd declare, waving a dismissive hand. But as Elizabeth grew, her silence became undeniable. Other children would call her name, and she wouldn't turn. A bell would ring, signaling dinner, and she would remain oblivious until someone gently guided her. The doctor, a portly man named Dr. Silas Croft, was summoned. He peered into her ears, shone a small lamp, and shook his head with a sigh. "A profound affliction, Mrs. Caldwell. The child is deaf. Completely." The diagnosis settled over the household like a shroud. For Clara, it was a fresh sorrow in a life already burdened. She would spend hours with Elizabeth, teaching her simple gestures, tracing letters in the dirt, trying to bridge the chasm of silence that separated them. Elizabeth, in turn, was an eager, if sometimes frustrated, pupil. She learned to read lips with an uncanny quickness, her eyes darting, absorbing every subtle movement. She communicated through a series of expressive gestures and a few guttural sounds. sounds that were more felt than heard, vibrations in her own throat that she could perceive. The other enslaved people on the estate viewed Elizabeth with a mixture of pity and a strange reverence. Some believed her silence was a mark of divine favor, a special connection to a world beyond human understanding. Others saw it as a curse, a further burden in a life already defined by hardship. Young Thomas, a boy a few years older than Elizabeth, who worked in the stables, would often try to communicate with her. He'd stomp his feet, hoping she'd feel the vibrations, or tap out rhythms on a wooden bucket, watching her face for any sign of recognition. Sometimes a faint smile would touch her lips, a flicker of understanding in her deep eyes. But the true meaning of sound remained elusive to her. Mrs. Caldwell, however, saw Elizabeth's condition not as a tragedy, but as an inconvenience. A deaf child was less useful, harder to instruct. She was often left to her own devices, wandering the edges of the fields, observing the silent dance of nature, or sitting by the river, feeling the subtle tremors of the water against the bank. It was during one such solitary afternoon, as Elizabeth sat beneath a weeping willow, her fingers trailing in the cool current, that Mrs. Caldwell's sister, Mrs. Eleanor Hathaway, arrived for her annual visit. Mrs. Hathaway was a woman of refined tastes and a keen, if somewhat ruthless, business acumen. She had inherited a small fortune and managed it with an iron fist, always seeking new ventures, new opportunities for profit. She was a widow, her life a tapestry of social engagements and shrewd investments. Her arrival was always an event, heralded by the rumble of her carriage and the rustle of her expensive silks. On this particular visit, Mrs. Hathaway, a woman who prided herself on her discerning eye, noticed Elizabeth. The child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, was humming to herself, a low, resonant sound that seemed to emanate from deep within her chest. It was a wordless melody, a series of sustained tones that, to Mrs. Hathaway's surprise, possessed an unusual purity. "What is that child doing?" Mrs. Hathaway asked, her voice sharp, cutting through the humid air. Mrs. Caldwell, fanning herself on the veranda, glanced towards Elizabeth. "Oh, that's Elizabeth, my laundress's child. She's deaf, poor thing. She often makes those noises. We pay them no mind." But Mrs. Hathaway did pay mind. She watched Elizabeth, her brow furrowed in thought. The child's humming was not tuneless, not discordant. It had a strange, almost ethereal quality. She approached Elizabeth, her silk skirts rustling. Elizabeth looked up, her eyes wide, unblinking. Mrs. Hathaway knelt, placing a hand gently on Elizabeth's chest. The vibrations were distinct, powerful. "She's deaf, you say?" Mrs. Hathaway murmured, more to herself than to her sister. "Completely." "As a stone," Mrs. Caldwell confirmed with a shrug. Never heard a sound in her life. A flicker of an idea, cold and calculating, began to take root in Mrs. Hathaway's mind. A seed of possibility, both wondrous and terrifying. She spent the rest of her visit observing Elizabeth, testing her in subtle ways. She would clap her hands loudly behind the child, only to see no reaction. She would speak directly into her ear, her voice raised, and Elizabeth would only watch her lips, patiently waiting for a gesture. Yet when Elizabeth hummed, the sound was undeniably beautiful, a raw, untamed purity that seemed to defy her condition. Mrs. Hathaway left the Caldwell estate with a new purpose. The image of the silent child, her chest vibrating with an impossible melody, had lodged itself firmly in her thoughts. She saw not a tragedy, but an opportunity, a unique, unprecedented spectacle. The world she knew was hungry for wonders, for the inexplicable. And in Elizabeth, she believed she had found a wonder that could captivate, and more importantly, enrich her. The stage was being set, not for a performance, but for an elaborate, chilling experiment. The following spring, a new figure arrived at the Caldwell estate. his presence as unsettling as a sudden chill in the air. Dr. Cornelius Webb was a man of imposing stature. His frame was lean and angular, his face a study in sharp angles and intellectual intensity. His eyes, a piercing shade of gray, seemed to miss nothing, constantly scanning, analyzing. He carried himself with an air of detached authority, a man accustomed to being listened to being obeyed. His reputation preceded him. A brilliant, if unconventional, physician and anatomist from Philadelphia, known for his groundbreaking, often controversial research into the human senses. Rumors whispered of his fascination with the macabre, his relentless pursuit of knowledge. Even if it meant pushing the boundaries of ethical conduct, Dr. Webb was not a man to be swayed by sentiment. His motivations were complex, a tangled web of scientific curiosity, professional ambition, and a deep-seated desire to leave an indelible mark on the world of medicine. He had corresponded with Mrs. Hathaway for months, their letters filled with coded language, veiled suggestions, and the careful outlining of a project. Mrs. Hathaway, ever the pragmatist, had painted a picture of a unique medical anomaly, a case study that could bring unprecedented recognition and profit to all involved. She had appealed to his scientific ego, his thirst for the extraordinary. His arrival was met with a mixture of awe and apprehension by the Caldwell household. He moved through the plantation with a quiet intensity, his gaze lingering on Elizabeth, who in turn regarded him with her usual silent scrutiny. He spent days observing her, watching her interactions, her movements, her peculiar humming. He noted the way she seemed to feel the vibrations of the ground, the subtle tremors of a distant cart, the rhythmic pounding of a blacksmith's hammer. Finally, the day came for the formal examination. Elizabeth, now nearly 9, was led into a dimly lit room in the main house, a room usually reserved for formal dinners, now transformed into a makeshift clinic. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and something metallic, a smell that made Elizabeth subtly recoil. Dr. Webb stood over a table laden with an array of instruments, gleaming otoscopes, delicate tuning forks, a small polished wooden box, and various other tools that looked both scientific and vaguely menacing. Mrs. Hathaway stood by, her hands clasped tightly, a nervous energy radiating from her usually composed demeanor. Mrs. Caldwell, pale and apprehensive, hovered in the doorway, her conscience warring with her sister's persuasive arguments about Elizabeth's future. Dr. Webb began his examination with a methodical precision that was both chilling and impressive. He peered into Elizabeth's ears, his brow furrowed, his lips moving in silent commentary. He tapped a small hammer gently on her knees, observing her reflexes. He ran a feather lightly over her skin, noting her sensitivity. Elizabeth remained stoic, her eyes following his every move, a flicker of fear deep within them. Then came the sound experiments. Dr. Webb took a large tuning fork, struck it sharply against the table, and held it close to Elizabeth's ear. No reaction. He repeated the action, placing the vibrating prongs against her mastoid bone behind her ear. Elizabeth's eyes widened slightly. A subtle tremor ran through her. He noted it down. He then placed the vibrating fork against her forehead, her sternum, her fingertips. Each time, a faint, almost imperceptible reaction. He moved to a small polished wooden box, a resonant chamber he had designed. He struck a series of different tuning forks, each producing a distinct vibration. He held the box against Elizabeth's chest, then her back, then her skull. Elizabeth's reactions became more pronounced. Her breath would hitch, her fingers would twitch, her head would tilt as if trying to discern something just beyond her grasp. Remarkable, Dr. Webb murmured, his voice low, almost a whisper. The auditory canal is completely occluded, as expected. No response to airborne sound. But the bone conduction, the sensitivity to vibration, It is extraordinary. He then produced a small, intricately crafted monochord, a single string stretched over a resonant wooden box with a movable bridge to alter pitch. He plucked the string, then pressed the box against Elizabeth's chest. A deep, resonant hum filled the room, a vibration that Elizabeth clearly felt. Her eyes closed for a moment, a strange expression on her face, a mixture of discomfort and a nascent curiosity. Can you feel the difference?" Dr. Webb asked, his voice calm, his gaze unwavering. He moved the bridge, changing the pitch, and plucked the string again. Elizabeth, after a moment of intense concentration, nodded slowly. Her finger instinctively moved, tracing an invisible pattern in the air, mimicking the rise and fall of the vibration she felt. A profound realization dawned on Dr. Webb. It wasn't that Elizabeth heard sound in the conventional sense. It was that her entire body was an exquisitely sensitive resonator, capable of perceiving the subtle nuances of vibration that most people filtered out. Her deafness was absolute, but her perception of sound through bone and tissue was unparalleled. She didn't hear the melody. She felt its architecture. A cold, calculating thrill ran through Dr. Webb. The scientific implications were immense. But then another thought, darker and more insidious, began to take hold. He looked at Mrs. Hathaway, whose eyes were fixed on him, gleaming with an unspoken question. He looked at Elizabeth, her small, vulnerable form, her silent, watchful gaze. "Mrs. Hathaway," he said, his voice carefully modulated, "we have here a phenomenon, a medical marvel. But more than that, we have an opportunity." Over the next few days, Dr. Webb and Mrs. Hathaway engaged in a series of hushed, intense conversations. They met in the drawing room, the heavy velvet curtains drawn, their voices low, almost conspiratorial. "She cannot hear, Cornelius," Mrs. Hathaway reiterated, her voice a strained whisper. "How can she possibly sing? She perceives the vibrations, Eleanor," Dr. Webb explained, his tone patient yet firm. "The frequency, the intensity, the duration. Her vocal cords, her diaphragm, her entire skeletal structure are attuned to these subtle shifts. She can feel the music, and therefore she can replicate it. Not through hearing, but through an innate, almost instinctual physical response. But to train her, to make her sing opera." Mrs. Hathaway's skepticism was evident, yet her eyes held a greedy glint. The public would never believe it. "That, Eleanor, is precisely the point." Webb countered, a faint, unsettling smile playing on his lips. "The public will believe it. They will believe it is a miracle, a divine gift, a testament to the extraordinary power of the human spirit. And we, my dear Eleanor, will be the instruments of that revelation." He laid out his plan with chilling precision. Elizabeth would be removed from the plantation, brought to Philadelphia, where she would undergo intensive, specialized training. He would teach her to control her voice, to modulate her pitch and tone, not by listening, but by feeling the vibrations within her own body, by observing the movements of his lips, by mimicking the physical sensations he would impart. Mrs. Hathaway listened, her initial reservations slowly eroding under the weight of Webb's persuasive arguments and the tantalizing prospect of immense wealth and renown. She thought of her dwindling investments, her social standing, the constant pressure to maintain appearances. Elizabeth, a child she barely knew, a child considered a burden, could be her salvation. "It will require absolute secrecy, Eleanor," Webb stressed, his gaze piercing. "No one must know the true nature of her condition. The illusion must be perfect. The miracle, absolute." Mrs. Hathaway nodded slowly, her face hardening. The moral conflict, if it had ever truly existed, was now buried beneath layers of ambition and self-preservation. She justified it to herself as an act of benevolence, a chance for Elizabeth to escape a life of servitude, to achieve something extraordinary. The truth, however, was far more sinister. She was not freeing Elizabeth. She was merely transferring her from one form of bondage to another, more elaborate, more profitable one. The dark pact was not a single moment, but a calculated, chilling decision, forged in the quiet desperation of ambition, sealing Elizabeth's fate to a life lived as a living, breathing paradox. The journey from the sun-drenched fields of Maryland to the bustling, gaslit streets of Philadelphia was a dizzying blur for Elizabeth. The world outside the Caldwell estate was a kaleidoscope of new sensations. The rhythmic jostle of the carriage, the unfamiliar smells of coal smoke and horse manure, the constant, silent rush of people. She was taken to a modest townhouse in a quiet, respectable neighborhood, a place far removed from the familiar sights of the plantation, a place where her new life, or rather her new existence, would begin. The training was relentless, meticulous, and often terrifying. Dr. Webb, now her sole instructor and overseer, transformed a small, sparsely furnished room into a private studio. The windows were often draped, creating a perpetual twilight, as if to emphasize the internal nature of her learning. The room contained a grand piano, its polished surface reflecting the dim light, and a series of custom-built instruments, a large resonant wooden box designed to amplify vibrations, a set of precisely calibrated tuning forks, and a complex device Webb called a vibrational harmonizer, a series of metal plates that could be struck to produce specific frequencies. Elizabeth's days became a grueling regimen. Webb would sit at the piano, his fingers moving silently across the keys, his lips forming the shapes of notes and words. Elizabeth, perched on a stool, would watch him with an intensity that bordered on pain, her eyes straining to catch every nuance of his facial expressions, every subtle movement of his throat. "Feel the resonance, Elizabeth." Webb would instruct, his voice a low, steady rumble that she perceived as a deep vibration in the floorboards, in the air around them. He would place her hand on the piano's soundboard, then strike a low C. Elizabeth would feel the deep thrum, a powerful tremor that resonated through her bones. "Now replicate that. Feel it in your chest, in your diaphragm." She would try, her throat tightening, her breath catching. At first, her attempts were crude, guttural sounds, more like a moan than a melody. Webb would patiently, sometimes impatiently, guide her. He would place his hand on her throat, then on his own, demonstrating the subtle muscular contractions. He would press her hand against his chest as he sang a note, allowing her to feel the internal vibrations, the rise and fall of his breath. "Higher, Elizabeth. Feel the tension here." He would indicate her vocal cords. "The lightness in your head." He would strike a higher note on the piano, a sharper, more delicate vibration. Elizabeth would struggle, her face contorted in concentration, until a thin, reedy sound emerged. The process was agonizingly slow. Weeks bled into months. Elizabeth learned to associate specific lip movements with certain vocalizations. She learned to control her breath, to project her voice, not by hearing its volume, but by feeling the pressure in her lungs, the vibrations against her palate. Webb taught her to feel the subtle shifts in pitch by placing her hand on the resonant box, then on her own chest, guiding her to match the internal sensation. He introduced her to the concept of harmony by having her feel two different vibrations simultaneously, one in each hand, then guiding her to produce a single note that resonated with both. It was a language of touch, of internal sensation, a world built entirely on the unseen. Elizabeth's confusion was profound. She understood that she was learning to make sounds, beautiful sounds. That seemed to please Dr. Webb and Mrs. Hathaway. But the purpose remained a mystery. She saw the other children playing in the street, heard their silent laughter, and wondered what secret joy they shared that she could not access. Sometimes a wave of despair would wash over her, a crushing sense of isolation. She would retreat into herself, refusing to sing, her eyes filled with a silent plea. It was during these moments that Mrs. Hathaway would intervene. She would sit with Elizabeth, her demeanor softening, her voice laced with a false tenderness. "Elizabeth, my dear, you have a gift. A truly extraordinary gift. Dr. Webb is helping you share it with the world. Imagine a life beyond this house, beyond the fields. A life of admiration, of respect." Mrs. Hathaway would paint vivid pictures of grand concert halls, of elegant ladies and gentlemen applauding, of a life free from the drudgery of servitude. She spoke of Elizabeth's mother, Clara, and how proud she would be. These words, though manipulative, offered a glimmer of hope to Elizabeth, a reason to endure the arduous training. She yearned for connection, for acceptance, and Mrs. Hathaway skillfully exploited that yearning. As Elizabeth's voice grew stronger, more controlled, Webb began to introduce her to more complex pieces. He would play entire operatic arias on the piano, his fingers flying across the keys, his body swaying with the music. Elizabeth would watch, her eyes tracing the movements, her hands often pressed against the piano's frame, absorbing the intricate patterns of vibration. Then she would attempt to replicate them. Her voice, a raw, powerful instrument, slowly, painstakingly shaped itself into the melodies she could only feel. The transformation was astonishing. Her voice, once a simple hum, now possessed an incredible range, a rich timbre, and an almost supernatural purity. It was a voice that seemed to defy its origins, a voice born of silence, yet capable of soaring to operatic heights. Other characters began to notice the strange goings on in the Hathaway townhouse. The house staff, mostly Irish immigrants, whispered amongst themselves. They heard the powerful, resonant voice emanating from the closed room, a voice that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. They saw Elizabeth, a young black girl, always accompanied by Dr. Webb or Mrs. Hathaway, her eyes constantly scanning, her movements precise. They knew she was deaf, a fact that made her singing all the more unsettling. Rumors began to circulate in the neighborhood. Tales of a miracle child, a divine voice, a gift from God. Dr. Webb, ever the strategist, carefully cultivated these rumors. He would drop hints to acquaintances, speak vaguely of a unique medical case he was overseeing, allowing the mystery to deepen. He understood that the more incredible the story, the more captivating the spectacle would be. He was not just training a singer. He was crafting a legend, a carefully constructed illusion designed to enthrall and to profit. The shadows of the past were not merely a backdrop. They were the very fabric of Elizabeth's new, manipulated reality. The whispers grew louder, spreading beyond the quiet streets of Philadelphia. The miracle child of Mrs. Hathaway's household became a topic of hushed conversation in drawing rooms and coffee houses. Dr. Webb, with his calculated leaks and enigmatic pronouncements, ensured that curiosity reached a fever pitch before any public unveiling. He understood the power of anticipation, the allure of the forbidden. The preparations for Elizabeth's public debut were meticulous, almost theatrical. Mrs. Hathaway spared no expense, commissioning elegant gowns for Elizabeth, selecting a small, exclusive venue, a private salon known for hosting cultural events, and sending out invitations to a carefully curated list of influential citizens, prominent physicians, and discerning critics. The narrative was carefully crafted, a young, gifted Negro girl, born into unimaginable hardship, now blessed with a voice of unparalleled beauty, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. The deafness was mentioned, but always as a tragic affliction overcome by an almost divine talent, never as the key to her unique perception. The evening of the debut arrived, a crisp autumn night in Philadelphia. Carriages lined the cobblestone street outside the salon, their lamps casting flickering shadows. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of perfume, polished wood, and nervous anticipation. The invited guests, a mix of the city's elite, abolitionists, and a few skeptical journalists, murmured amongst themselves, their eyes darting towards the small stage draped in velvet. Elizabeth, dressed in a simple but elegant gown of deep blue, stood backstage, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She felt the vibrations of the floorboards, the subtle tremors of the distant chatter, the rhythmic pulse of her own fear. Dr. Webb stood beside her, his hand a reassuring yet firm presence on her arm. He whispered instructions, his lips moving silently, reminding her of the cues, the breathing, the focus. "Remember, Elizabeth," he mouthed, his eyes intense. "Feel the music. Let it flow through you." When her name was announced, a hush fell over the room. Elizabeth walked onto the stage, her movements graceful, her head held high. The gaslights cast a warm glow on her face, highlighting the striking contrast of her dark skin against the pale blue of her gown. She stood before the audience, a silent, enigmatic figure, her eyes scanning the faces, searching for understanding. The pianist, a young man named Mr. Arthur Finch, began the introduction to a simple aria. Elizabeth felt the deep vibrations of the piano through the stage, a familiar anchor. She closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself, feeling the music's architecture within her. Then she opened her mouth, and a sound, pure and resonant, filled the room. It was a voice that defied belief, rich, powerful, yet imbued with a delicate clarity. It soared through the salon, touching every corner, every listener. The audience sat spellbound, their initial skepticism replaced by a profound awe. How could a deaf woman produce such a sound? It was impossible, yet undeniably real. Tears welled in the eyes of some, others leaned forward, their mouths slightly agape. When the aria concluded, a moment of stunned silence hung in the air before erupting into thunderous applause. Elizabeth felt the vibrations of their clapping, a wave of energy washing over her. She bowed, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. For the first time, she felt a strange sense of power, a connection to these silent, applauding figures. The performance was a triumph. The next day, the newspapers were filled with breathless accounts of the silent nightingale, the miracle voice of Philadelphia. Journalists, initially skeptical, now wrote with a sense of wonder, describing Elizabeth's voice as a phenomenon beyond human comprehension, a testament to divine grace. Fame, swift and intoxicating, descended upon Elizabeth. Mrs. Hathaway, now basking in the reflected glory, began planning a grand tour. New York, Boston, Washington, D.C., the major cities clamored to witness the extraordinary spectacle. Dr. Webb, his scientific ambition now intertwined with a growing financial empire, meticulously managed every aspect of Elizabeth's public life, ensuring the narrative of the miracle remained untarnished. As the performances continued, Elizabeth's understanding of her situation deepened, albeit slowly. She began to notice the subtle differences in the way people reacted to her. The awe, the pity, the occasional flicker of suspicion in the eyes of some doctors who attended her concerts. She saw the way Dr. Webb and Mrs. Hathaway guarded her, controlled her interactions, always present, always watchful. She was a prized possession, a valuable commodity, and she felt the weight of that ownership. During one performance in New York, a renowned ear specialist, Dr. Alastair Finch, sat in the audience. He had read the sensational reports, but his scientific mind rebelled against the notion of a truly deaf person singing with such perfection. He observed Elizabeth with a keen, analytical eye, noting her subtle movements, the way she seemed to anticipate the pianist's cues, the almost imperceptible tremor in her body as she sang. He noticed that she never seemed to react to the applause, only to the vibrations of the stomping feet. A seed of doubt, a scientific curiosity, began to sprout in his mind. Another figure, a tenacious journalist named Mr. Elias Thorne, also attended Elizabeth's concerts. Thorne was known for his investigative prowess, his ability to uncover the hidden truths behind public facades. He found the story of the silent nightingale too perfect, too miraculous. He watched Dr. Webb and Mrs. Hathaway with a cynical eye, sensing a carefully constructed illusion. He began to ask discreet questions, to delve into Elizabeth's past, to search for the cracks in the carefully polished narrative. Elizabeth, meanwhile, continued to sing, her voice growing ever more powerful, ever more expressive. But beneath the surface of her extraordinary performances, a quiet storm was brewing. She was no longer just a child mimicking vibrations. She was a young woman, increasingly aware of her unique condition and the complex, often unsettling web of manipulation that surrounded her. The mystery was no longer just for the audience. It was becoming Elizabeth's own, deeply personal enigma, a silent question echoing in the chambers of her unheard world. The tour continued, a whirlwind of opulent theaters, hushed audiences, and thunderous applause. From the grand halls of Boston to the intimate parlors of Washington, D.C., Elizabeth's voice captivated the nation. Each performance was a testament to her extraordinary talent and to Dr. Webb's meticulous training. Yet, beneath the glittering surface of her burgeoning fame, the illusion began to fray, ever so subtly. In Boston, during a performance at the Tremont Theater, a minor incident occurred that to the casual observer was insignificant, but to the watchful eyes of Dr. Alastair Finch and Mr. Elias Thorne was a telling detail. The gaslight above the stage flickered violently, then briefly extinguished, plunging Elizabeth into momentary darkness. The pianist, Mr. Finch, missed a beat, his fingers faltering. For a split second, Elizabeth's voice wavered, a note held too long, a slight hesitation before she found her rhythm again. Dr. Webb, observing from the wings, visibly tensed. If Elizabeth truly heard nothing, why would a visual disruption affect her timing? It was a question that gnawed at Dr. Finch. Mr. Thorne, the journalist, was relentless in his pursuit of the truth. He interviewed former staff from the Caldwell estate, discreetly questioning them about Elizabeth's early life. He learned of her profound deafness, a fact that made her current abilities all the more perplexing. He noted the strict control Dr. Webb and Mrs. Hathaway exerted over Elizabeth. Her limited interactions with others, the way she was always chaperoned. He tried to speak with Elizabeth directly after a performance in New York, but was politely yet firmly rebuffed by Dr. Webb, who cited Elizabeth's delicate constitution and need for rest. Elizabeth herself was becoming increasingly aware of the strange nature of her existence. She noticed the way Dr. Webb's eyes would dart nervously when a new doctor or journalist was in the audience. She felt the subtle tension in Mrs. Hathaway's hand when she guided her through a crowd. She began to experiment subtly with her own perceptions. During rehearsals, she would sometimes close her eyes, trying to rely solely on the vibrations of the piano, on the internal sensations of her own voice. She found that while she could maintain pitch and rhythm, the nuances, the emotional inflections, were harder to achieve without the visual cues of Webb's lips and the pianist's movements. She realized that her hearing was a complex tapestry of touch, sight, and internal resonance, not the simple act of listening. Dr. Webb, sensing Elizabeth's growing awareness, became increasingly paranoid. He tightened his control, limiting her access to books, to conversations, to any information that might challenge the narrative he had so carefully constructed. He would spend hours with her, not just on vocal training, but on reinforcing the miracle story, emphasizing her unique gift, her divine purpose. He would praise her lavishly, then subtly remind her of her dependence on him, on Mrs. Hathaway for her new life. His control was a silken cage, beautiful on the outside but suffocating within. Mrs. Hathaway, meanwhile, was deteriorating. The constant pressure, the weight of their deception, was taking its toll. She began to rely heavily on laudanum, her eyes often glazed, her hands trembling. She would have moments of profound guilt, staring at Elizabeth with a haunted expression. One evening, after a particularly triumphant performance in Philadelphia, she found Elizabeth alone in her dressing room, practicing a difficult passage. Mrs. Hathaway watched her, her face etched with a mixture of awe and despair. "Elizabeth," she whispered, her voice slurred, Do you truly understand what you are doing?" Elizabeth turned, her eyes wide and questioning. She watched Mrs. Hathaway's lips, waiting for clarification. Mrs. Hathaway shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "Never mind, child. Just keep singing." She fled the room, leaving Elizabeth more confused than ever. The medical community, initially captivated, was now divided. Some hailed Elizabeth as a medical marvel, a testament to the brain's plasticity. Others, like Dr. Finch, remained deeply skeptical. He began to publish articles in obscure medical journals, subtly questioning the prevailing narrative, suggesting alternative explanations based on bone conduction and heightened sensory perception. He never directly accused Webb of deception, but his carefully worded inquiries planted seeds of doubt. Mr. Thorne, the journalist, was closing in. He had discovered a former associate of Dr. Webb's, a disgruntled medical student named Mr. Arthur Davies, who had worked with Webb on his early research into sensory perception. Davies, bitter about being excluded from Webb's current success, revealed details of Webb's experimental methods, his fascination with sensory substitution, and his belief that the brain could be trained to interpret vibrations as sound. He spoke of Webb's ambition, his ruthlessness, his willingness to push boundaries. The tension mounted with each passing day. Elizabeth felt it, a low hum of anxiety that resonated through her body. She saw the furtive glances, the whispered conversations, the growing scrutiny. She was a paradox, a living enigma, and the world was beginning to demand answers. The illusion, so carefully constructed, was on the verge of collapse, threatening to expose the chilling truth behind the unheard melody. The stage was set for a final, climactic performance, one that would either solidify her legend or shatter it completely. The grand performance in Philadelphia was to be the culmination of Elizabeth's tour, a triumphant return to the city where her legend had begun. The Academy of Music, a magnificent edifice of red brick and white marble, was packed to its gilded rafters. Every seat was filled, from the opulent boxes to the cheapest gallery perches. The air crackled with anticipation, a palpable energy that Elizabeth felt as a deep, resonant hum through the polished stage floor. Dr. Webb, impeccably dressed, moved backstage with a nervous energy he struggled to conceal. His eyes darted constantly, scanning the faces of the stagehands, the musicians, the few journalists allowed backstage. He knew Dr. Finch and Mr. Thorne were in the audience, their skepticism a tangible weight in the air. This performance had to be flawless, beyond reproach. Mrs. Hathaway, pale and trembling, clutched a small vial of laudanum in her gloved hand. Her eyes were wide, her gaze fixed on Elizabeth, who stood quietly, her hands clasped, her face a mask of serene concentration. Elizabeth wore a gown of shimmering ivory, a stark contrast to her dark skin, making her appear almost ethereal under the gaslights. The orchestra began the overture, a powerful surge of vibrations that Elizabeth felt deep in her chest. She watched the conductor, his baton a silent blur, guiding the musicians through the intricate piece. When it was time for her entrance, she walked onto the stage, bathed in the warm glow of the footlights, to a thunderous ovation. She felt the rhythmic stomping of feet, the powerful vibrations of applause, a wave of energy that momentarily overwhelmed her. Her first aria was a triumph. Her voice soared, filling the vast hall with its incredible power and purity. The audience was mesmerized, lost in the beauty of the sound. Dr. Finch, however, watched her with a critical eye. He noticed the subtle way her eyes tracked the conductor, the almost imperceptible movements of her head, as if she were feeling the direction of the sound. He also noticed that when a particularly loud cymbal crash occurred, a sound that would make most people flinch, Elizabeth remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged. During the intermission, a carefully orchestrated test was set in motion. Mr. Thorne, through a contact on the Academy's board, had arranged for a renowned but notoriously eccentric composer, Monsieur Dubois, to conduct a surprise piece. Dubois was known for his improvisational style, his sudden shifts in tempo and dynamics, making it impossible for Elizabeth to have rehearsed the piece. When Elizabeth returned to the stage for the second act, Monsieur Dubois, a flamboyant figure with wild gray hair, took the conductor's podium. He bowed dramatically, then turned to the orchestra. He began to conduct a piece Elizabeth had never seen, never felt. Panic flickered in Elizabeth's eyes. She looked at Dr. Webb in the wings, a silent plea for guidance. Webb's face was ashen. He knew this was the trap. He could only mouth, "Watch me!" his lips forming the words with desperate urgency. Elizabeth turned back to Dubois, her heart pounding. She watched his every move, every subtle gesture of his hands, the sway of his body. The orchestra began to play, a complex, unfamiliar melody. Elizabeth felt the vibrations, a chaotic jumble of unfamiliar patterns. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to center herself, to find the rhythm, the pulse. She began to sing, her voice initially hesitant, a little off key. The audience stirred, a ripple of unease passing through the hall. Dr. Finch leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. Mr. Thorne scribbled furiously in his notebook. Elizabeth opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on Dubois. She began to mimic his movements, to anticipate his cues, to feel the subtle shifts in the orchestra's vibrations. She focused on the internal sensations of her own voice, trying to match the patterns she felt. It was a desperate, improvisational dance between her silent perception and the conductor's silent commands. Her voice slowly, painstakingly, began to find its footing. It was not the flawless, effortless performance of before. There were moments of strain, moments where her pitch wavered, moments where she seemed to be searching for the melody. But then, with a surge of raw power, she would find it, her voice soaring, imbued with an almost desperate intensity. As the piece reached its crescendo, Dubois, with a mischievous glint in his eye, suddenly stopped conducting. The orchestra, following his lead, fell silent. Elizabeth, caught in the momentum of her own performance, continued to sing for a few more bars, her voice echoing in the sudden, profound silence of the hall. The effect was devastating. The audience gasped. A collective murmur swept through the academy. Elizabeth, realizing her mistake, her voice dying in her throat, looked out at the sea of faces, her own face etched with confusion and dawning horror. She felt the vibrations of their whispers, their shock, their dawning understanding. Dr. Finch rose from his seat, his voice clear and resonant, cutting through the murmurs. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "a truly remarkable performance, but one that, I believe, reveals the true nature of this extraordinary talent. Elizabeth, as we know, is profoundly deaf. She does not hear sound. She perceives it through vibration, through touch, and through the visual cues of her conductor. When those cues are removed, when the music is unfamiliar, Her voice, while still beautiful, reveals its true, human origins. A wave of outrage, of confusion, of dawning realization swept through the audience. Some shouted, demanding answers. Others sat in stunned silence, their illusions shattered. Dr. Webb, seeing his carefully constructed empire crumble, rushed onto the stage, his face contorted in a desperate attempt to regain control.
"This is an outrage! A cruel trick!"
Monsieur Dubois has deliberately sabotaged her performance. But it was too late. The truth, or at least a significant part of it, had been revealed. Elizabeth, standing alone on the vast stage, felt the vibrations of the chaos, the anger, the disappointment. She looked at Dr. Webb, then at Mrs. Hathaway, who had collapsed into a chair in the wings, her face ashen. She finally understood. She was not a miracle. She was an instrument, a carefully crafted illusion, a paradox exploited for profit and ambition. The unheard melody had been unmasked, revealing the chilling silence beneath. The aftermath of the Philadelphia performance was a maelstrom of accusations, recriminations, and public scandal. The newspapers, once filled with adoring praise, now carried headlines screaming of the great deception, the silent fraud. Dr. Webb, his reputation in tatters, attempted to defend himself, arguing that his methods were groundbreaking, that Elizabeth's talent was genuine regardless of its origins. But the public, feeling betrayed, was unforgiving. His medical practice dwindled, his scientific ambitions ridiculed. He retreated into obscurity, a bitter and disgraced figure, forever haunted by the collapse of his grand experiment. Mrs. Hathaway, utterly broken by the scandal and her own complicity, suffered a complete mental collapse. Her reliance on laudanum became an addiction, and she spent her remaining years in a state of semi-lucidity, whispering apologies to an unseen Elizabeth, her guilt a constant, tormenting companion. Her fortune, once a source of pride, was quickly depleted by legal fees and her deteriorating health. Elizabeth, the silent epicenter of the storm, found herself in a precarious position. The public, while initially feeling deceived, also felt a strange pity for her. She was, after all, a victim of circumstance, a young woman exploited by ambitious adults. Abolitionist societies, who had initially championed her as a symbol of black excellence, now rallied to her cause, offering her protection and support. Dr. Alastair Finch, the skeptical physician, and Mr. Elias Thorne, the tenacious journalist, played crucial roles in shaping the narrative of Elizabeth's future. They published detailed accounts of their investigation, explaining the scientific principles of bone conduction and heightened sensory perception, demystifying the miracle, without diminishing Elizabeth's extraordinary talent. They argued that her ability to sing, despite her deafness, was a testament not to divine intervention, but to the incredible adaptability of the human body and mind. Elizabeth, now free from the suffocating control of Webb and Hathaway, faced a choice. The world still wanted to hear her sing, but on different terms. She could continue to perform, but the illusion was shattered. She would no longer be the silent nightingale, but Elizabeth, the deaf singer, a woman who felt music rather than heard it. She chose to continue, but her performances changed. She no longer relied solely on visual cues. She worked with new musicians, explaining her unique perception, teaching them to communicate through touch, through subtle vibrations. She learned to conduct herself, feeling the rhythm through the floor, through the air, through the internal resonance of her own body. Her voice, though still powerful, gained a new depth, a raw emotional honesty that resonated with audiences in a different, perhaps more profound way. Elizabeth never fully understood the concept of sound as others did. The world remained a silent, vibrating canvas for her. But she learned to navigate it, to interpret its subtle tremors, to translate them into the universal language of music. She became a symbol, not of a miracle, but of resilience, of the human capacity to adapt and create beauty in the face of profound adversity. Her career, though less sensational than its initial meteoric rise, was long and respected. She performed across the country, inspiring countless individuals, particularly those with disabilities, to pursue their passions. She never spoke publicly about the deception, choosing instead to let her voice, her unique form of communication, speak for itself. The legacy of Elizabeth Greenfield, the black woman who sang like an opera diva but was born completely deaf, became a complex tapestry. For some, she remained a figure of wonder, a testament to the inexplicable. For others, she was a cautionary tale of ambition and exploitation. But for those who truly understood, she was a pioneer, a living embodiment of the extraordinary ways in which the human spirit can transcend its perceived limitations. Her story, born in the shadows of manipulation, ultimately became a beacon of quiet strength, an echo in the silence that continues to resonate through history. The story of Elizabeth Greenfield is a testament to the extraordinary and often unsettling truths hidden within the annals of history. It reminds us that the most profound mysteries are often found not in the supernatural, but in the depths of human ingenuity, ambition, and the complex tapestry of our senses. If Elizabeth's unheard melody has resonated with you, if her silent struggle and eventual triumph have stirred your curiosity, then join our community. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear for more tales that blur the lines between history and horror, between the known and the chillingly unknown.